Except in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Please have a seat, and those of you at home, whatever you're doing this now. There's a Christian organization I'm involved with tangentially that have a great tagline. It said, it's kind of a podcast group, it says, honest conversations about interactive life with God. Honest conversations about interactive life with God. And I thought that was quite a cool tagline that I like to think is kind of partly what church and St. James would like to be about, you know. And this sermon, this passage we have today, there's an awful lot in it, but I want to just focus on three particular aspects of what the journey of faith looks like and how this speaks into it for us, particularly in our time. And the first is that these guys have been out fishing all night and they haven't caught a single thing. So they'd be feeling disappointed. That's the first thing. Disappointed. Simon Reeves had a wee travel program around the Mediterranean in one of his series he was doing. And he went out with some guys in their boat, and they literally caught hardly anything all night because the Med was overfished. And it, you know, it's pretty gutting if you spend the whole night out fishing and not catching anything, and you really need to catch this stuff. So I think a deep, deep sense of disappointment. And that might be something some of us can relate to. If you've been around the block a bit or two, you've had your fair share of disappointments in life. And disappointments come in different shapes and sizes and at different levels. Sometimes they can be superficial. They haven't quite got the chocolate in the shop that you're hoping they were going to have. They just run out, you know what I mean? And I went to 4 different pharmacies yesterday trying to get a lateral flow test. Couldn't find any anywhere, you know. And so superficial stuff. But there's also deeper things in which perhaps somebody's really let you down. Or there's things that you were hoping for when you were younger that never happened. Or perhaps something that you were afraid did happen. Or maybe even on a spiritual level, things that you prayed for or hoped for haven't come to pass. Or even within our church, things we long for our church that aren't happening. So disappointment is something that is part of the warp and the woof of life. And it can be a real burden. There can be a sense in which you or I or whatever, you may feel you're not just living plan A or plan B for your life. You're on plan kind of V or Y, you know what I mean? And it's really not going according to how you were hoping it was going to go. And it's not being what you hoped it was going to be. And disappointment is part of the human life, but it is also very much part of the Christian life. Because one of the mistakes we can make, and this is part, as a minister, you have to learn to live how you handle disappointment in ministry generally. And one of the things I have learned over the years, which I forget at times, and my wife reminds me of this and gets me back on track again, you know. But part of it is being a faithful Christian is not about being absolutely set on certain things happening. Faith is not about success all the time. It really isn't. It really, really isn't. Outcomes are important, but we have to really lay the outcomes with God. And there can be times where you metaphorically been fishing on the wrong side of the boat all night or for a number of years in church and nothing's happening. And you've got to say, well, what do you do with that? What do we do with that in our lives? And there is such a thing called costly faith, as opposed to cheap faith. Cheap faith is the kind of faith which doesn't hope for much anyway, so isn't neglected, isn't disappointed when things don't happen. All right? Costly faith is the kind of faith that invests itself in things. Costly faith is something which believes you really want something to happen, or you give yourself to something in the church, or you give yourself to something in the community, and you commit to something. And there's a big risk that it will not bear fruit. I mean, parenting is a great example of that, you know? And so there's a sense in which we have a choice. We either live our lives in a fully committed way, in which case we are setting ourselves up for painful disappointments at some time. Or we live our life, our faith, in a less committed way, in which case we're not so disappointed, because our hopes were never very high anyway. And that's a choice we all make, consciously or unconsciously. And the Christian is called to follow. We'll come back to that later on. To follow Jesus, the life of faith is not a life of guaranteed success. It is a process. It's a whole life of becoming. Who we are is who we are becoming. Who we are is who we are in our movement of growth. What is facing me this day? What is in my life this moment? Not what it was 20 years ago, not next 10 years ago, but what is it I am living? You are living your faith. Your faith is not something that you have on a particular guaranteed success, in which case you will always be disappointed, because so often it doesn't work out. The faith is about a relationship, and it comes back to the parallel to marriage, in which in a marriage vows, a couple say to one another that they will stick with each other whatever happens. And the journey of faith is like that. The journey of faith is about a commitment to a process of following Jesus. And that can lead to disappointment at times. But the disappointment is part of the journey. Does that make any sense? Does that make any sense? Now, unfortunately, Jesus doesn't always show up and say, in our life, fish on the other side and get all these fish in, and it's just like that. It happens magically. It's not about that. What it's about trust. It's about trusting Jesus with the disappointments in our life. And at that point in our life, and this is the great point of this point here, this story, is that Jesus met them at their darkest, lowest point. Although they'd seen him, he was coming and going, they weren't sure what was going on. Very uncertain, the disciples. Very uncertain. And as the darkness was there, as the dawn was coming, they discerned Jesus. And Jesus meets with us in our lowest and our darkest times. Sometimes through other people. Just like John said to Peter, it's the Lord, you know. We need one another to say, look, it's the Lord. He's here. There he is. Look for him in your life. Hang in there. To be encouraging of one another. So the first thing Jesus meets us then is in our disappointment and helps us to live with them through it to the other side of that, whatever that may look like for us. Coming to terms with these things and trusting that his purposes for us, for individuals, for our church, are in his hands, and we can trust it. But we can have lots of questions about that, and we'll come back to that later on. The second thing Jesus meets with the disciples is that they are hungry. They're hungry. I think sometimes in a life of faith, we think it's all about spiritual stuff, but actually the life of faith is about a whole person. And we all have genuine physical needs of different kinds. We are physical beings. And Jesus has got this wee breakfast ready for these guys. And it's very interesting. A number of times in the Bible, Jesus has meals with people. And he creates a space in which people are invited in. And there's a sense of hospitality and care for people, in which he's nurturing them. He's nourishing them. Not just spiritually, but physically too. And I'm just looking around this church this morning. I know so many of you have got lots of things going on. You give a lot of your time, you stretch. And the next thing, and there is this real sense in which sometimes we could forget Jesus actually just wants to care for us as well sometimes. He wants you to look after yourself. And I don't just mean that in a sort of pat you on the back kind of way, but in a genuine sense that Jesus does, and as a minister, it's very important that I am on the ball about that people don't feel too stretched, that they don't feel too overwhelmed by what's going on in their lives, that we can give each other that physical support that we need. And there is something about this reality of Jesus creating, and they weren't sure. It says here, none of the disciples did to ask him, who are you? Because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus' body was a bit different. It wasn't quite what it was before, but they knew it was him. But it's very ambiguous, the text. But they all testify that there was something different about him. But he didn't leave the physical behind. The physical is still part of Jesus. And for many of us, as we get older and all that goes with that, I just really want you to hear that our faith is really about all of our lives. And that the physical ailments and struggles that you may have that come with age, perhaps, these are not blocks to your faith journey. They are part of it. They're not something I wish I could wish this away. You can't wish it away. And as we get older, our aging process, I really believe, is part of that Christian journey. And that's why Jesus says to Peter at the very end, when you grow old, You'll be taken where you don't want to go, and others will fetch you, and all that. And I really want to honor, particularly in a church, we have a number of older people in it. You know, a lot of you, we're all getting older. Some of you are really getting older. You know what I mean? And there is this sense in which, you know, I don't want to make it as if getting old is something we don't talk about, as if it's tangential to our faith, or if it's a problem for us. It's not. It is an integral part of our faith journey, that we live with the realities of that. And Jesus meets us in the realities of that. And whatever cooking fish and baking bread means for you, that's what he does for you too. Believe it or not, Jesus is interested in that side of life. And finally, we have Jesus' conversation with Peter. And this Peter is a man who's racked with shame and guilt. And this is something which Jesus reaches into the shame and the guilt that Peter very much feels still. Even though he's met Jesus since then, he needed some kind of public restoration. And you know, all of us, in some way or another, will have elements of shame in our lives, have elements of guilt, of stuff that's long gone. We really can't do much about it now, but it's still there as an echo in your mind. I was just driving up past Loch Lomond just yesterday, and I always think of this. I've probably told you a story before, but I took my daughter camping when she was 4, and I mixed the tent up, didn't have all the tent material. I had to go back to Glasgow and pick her up again and take her up. By the time she was there, she was falling asleep in the car and all. And I just felt guilty for just messing that up, because she said, her wee voice said, "I was so looking forward to camping with my daddy." And I gave her a phone, and I said, "Hannah, that was your first disappointment, wasn't it, with me?" She said, "Dad, I can't even remember." But anyway, there we go. But, you know, some of these things, funny or not, but that we live with some of these things still. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge them. That's partly we have the Eucharist shortly, that Jesus meets us in our guilt and our shame. And just as Peter had had the charcoal fire in the high priest courtyard, also he has the charcoal fire here as well. There's an echo there. 3 times Jesus asked him, just as 3 times Peter denied him. Jesus was really, publicly, in front of the other disciples, really restoring Peter. All right? But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, he was trusting Peter. He was trusting Peter with his people. He was trusting them with his flock. And sometimes when we feel guilty about things that we've done wrong, Jesus doesn't just tap us on the back and say, "It's okay, fine, it doesn't matter." He gives us stuff to do. He commissions us with things that we can still do, not to earn that forgiveness, but just constructively to contribute once again. What we've done is done. But the best way often back from guilt and shame is to constructively do something else, to build back, whether it's that person or something else. And there's something here about the public restoration of Peter, which I feel speaks into all of our lives, as Anne was talking about last week, about the gift of the resurrection, about this peace in the Holy Spirit. I think one of the gifts he gives us is a commission to go and do something with your lives. And so for those of us who do have echoes of shame or guilt or the way that we have failed, that's not the final word in your story. It really, really isn't. It does matter. You messed up. I messed up. Messing up matters. That's part of the significance of being a human, is that when we make a mistake, it's costly. It hurts other people. It damages ourselves. But the way back from that is not staying there. It's moving through it with Christ and saying, "Well, what am I going to do about this? What can I do?" And Jesus trusts us, not necessarily to never make a mistake again, but again, it's about that relationship. It's like in a good friendship. When you mess up, you can get past it, because the trust may be dented, it may be bruised, it may be strained, but it's not broken. And Jesus still trusts you. So those 3 things in a disappointment, in a physical need, a hunger, and in our guilt, the post-resurrection Christ met the disciples and also meets with us. And all these things you can see are bundled together as we celebrate the Eucharist shortly. Let's just be quiet for a couple of minutes, and then we will stand and say the creed together.